You know the figure. Ridley Scott's Maximus Decimus Meridius, the betrayed general who loses everything, watches his family slaughtered, gets thrown into the arena as a slave. He's the everyman warrior fighting for vengeance in the dirt while crowds roar. Hollywood crystallized him into legend, gave him the kind of arc that satisfies audiences, that makes you believe one man's courage can topple an empire. But that wasn't what actually happened. The real Maximus, if he existed at all, didn't fall from grace. He didn't lose his family to an unstable tyrant. He didn't climb through the blood and suffering of the arena seeking redemption. The real Maximus, Marcus Nonius Macrinus, had a completely different story. He was successful. He was wealthy. He lived long, prospered, and died rich and powerful. There was no tragic downfall, no impossible revenge, no moment where everything was stripped away. The contrast between what Hollywood created and what history actually preserved is almost cruel in its ordinariness. But that's the thing about the real world. It rarely conforms to the shapes we want it to fit into. The historical Macrinus lived in a Rome that was nothing like the mythologized gladiator pits of cinema. The arena did exist, certainly. Crowds did gather. Blood was spilled for entertainment by the thousands. But the political machinery that sustained all of it was far more complex than any script could capture. To understand Macrinus, you have to understand the empire he served, the structures that elevated men like him, and the strange peace-to-chaos transition that defined the 2nd century of Roman rule. The Rome of the arena was built on a specific economy of violence. Public spectacles weren't just entertainment. They were political theatre. They were about projecting power, maintaining control over the population through carefully orchestrated displays of dominance. Emperors used the games to remind people of their status, their wealth, their ability to command life and death. A general like Maximus, or Macrinus, would have moved through this world with specific knowledge of how it operated. He wouldn't have been imprisoned in it. He would have been managing it, controlling it, benefiting from it. The Rome of Antoninus Pius, the emperor who ruled when Macrinus was rising through military ranks, was experiencing something unusual for the empire: peace. Not the peace of weakness, but the peace of dominance. Rome had no serious rivals. The borders were relatively secure. There were no catastrophic invasions threatening the heartland. This was the Pax Romana in its fullest expression, a moment where the empire could simply consolidate power and profit rather than fight for survival. In such an environment, a military officer's value changes. You're not fighting for survival anymore. You're managing territory, extracting wealth, building political alliances. The games, the spectacles, the arenas, these became tools of governance rather than desperate expressions of power. But peace is fragile. It requires maintenance. It requires men positioned in key places who understand how to keep the apparatus functioning. Men like Macrinus. The historical figure that emerges from fragmented records is difficult to pin down. That's partly because so little survives. He lived during an era when record-keeping was inconsistent, when documentation wasn't always preserved, when the personal archives of military officers often disappeared into the dust of centuries. What we know about Macrinus comes largely from a single source: his tomb. A marble mausoleum discovered in 2008 near the Tiber River in Rome, marked with Latin inscriptions that identified him as Marcus Nonius Macrinus, a man of considerable rank who had served in positions of real authority. The inscriptions don't tell a complete story, but they provide anchors, dates, positions, ranks. From these fragments, historians have tried to reconstruct a life born around 115 AD in Brea, a city in northern Italy, with roots stretching back over 3,000 years into antiquity, a place of prosperity and significance. A place where men with ambition could acquire the connections and education needed for advancement in the imperial system. but his early years are lost to time. We don't know his family circumstances. We don't know if he was wealthy or of modest means, well-educated or self-taught, favored by powerful patrons or forced to make his own way. The historical record simply doesn't preserve those details. It's frustrating because those early years often shaped careers, determined who rose and who remained obscure. But with Macrinus, we jump suddenly into the historical documentation at a moment when he had already achieved significant rank. By 152 AD, he held the position of legatus, a term that requires understanding because it's central to how Roman military power actually worked. A legatus was far more than a military officer. In the Roman system, it was one of the highest military ranks, something only the elite could aspire to. The position evolved over centuries. Originally, it was a way to delegate authority, to assign specific tasks to trusted men. But under Emperor Augustus, it became formalized. A legatus commanded a Roman legion, which meant he commanded somewhere around 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers. These were not mercenaries or conscripts. These were Rome's professional military machine, trained, disciplined, equipped with the best weapons the empire could manufacture. To command such a force was to wield power that could reshape provinces, that could make or break emperors if that commander decided to act. The position came with enormous wealth. Successful military campaigns meant spoils of war. A legatus was entitled to substantial shares. If you were fortunate enough, or ruthless enough, to lead campaigns that conquered territory, enslaved populations, seized treasure, you could accumulate wealth that rivaled or exceeded that of senators and consuls. This is why the position was so coveted. It wasn't just about military glory. It was about becoming obscenely rich, about leveraging that wealth into political power, about ensuring that your family would have advantages for generations. Macrinus clearly understood this. He maneuvered himself into command of the 12th Legion, a unit with history stretching back to Julius Caesar himself, marked with the emblem of Capricorn. This was no minor posting. It was a position of genuine significance in Rome's military hierarchy. From 152 to 154 AD, Macrinus governed Pannonia Inferior while commanding the 12th Legion. Pannonia Inferior, a region encompassing parts of modern-day Hungary, Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia. Not the wealthiest part of the empire, but strategically important. A frontier region. A place where Rome's military presence had to be maintained, where threats could emerge, where resources flowed and had to be managed. Under Antoninus Pius, such postings were relatively stable. The emperor was not a man of endless military ambition. He didn't launch massive campaigns or seek to expand the empire's borders dramatically. Instead, he delegated. He allowed his provincial commanders to operate with considerable autonomy. This was actually smart governance. It allowed the central authority to maintain control without having to personally manage every detail of military operations across the empire. For men like Macrinus, it meant opportunity. The wealth accumulated during these years would have been substantial. He was managing a region, commanding legions, collecting taxes, distributing spoils. A man in such a position could become very rich very quickly. The opportunity to take a share of everything that moved through the province, to build relationships with local elites, to consolidate power, all of this was available to someone positioned correctly. Macrinus positioned himself correctly. He built alliances, he accumulated wealth, he strengthened his military credentials. In 159 AD, he received a promotion, Pannonia Superior. Another frontier region, but one that covered even more territory, modern-day Hungary, Croatia, Austria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. A larger region to govern, more resources, more authority. This was advancement. This was recognition that Macrinus had performed well in his previous posting, that he understood how to manage power in a frontier environment, that he could be trusted with greater responsibility. The trajectory is clear. a man climbing the ladder, a man becoming more powerful, more wealthy, more influential, a man who understood the empire and how to work within its systems. But then something changed. In 161 AD, Emperor Antoninus Pius died. This was the turning point that would define the next phase of Macrinus's career. His successor was Marcus Aurelius, adopted son of Pius, a man who would become one of Rome's most famous emperors. Marcus Aurelius was different from his predecessor. He was not content to delegate everything to regional commanders. He was a philosopher, trained in Stoicism, but also a warrior. He believed in active engagement with the empire's problems. And almost immediately, he faced problems. The peace that Pius had maintained was breaking down. The Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube were pressing harder. The Marcomannic Wars were beginning. Decades of conflict that would define much of Marcus Aurelius's reign and test Rome's military resources to their limits. Macrinus's relationship with Marcus Aurelius became crucial. The new emperor seemed to value Macrinus's counsel and capability. Perhaps they had met before. Perhaps there were connections that history didn't preserve. But whatever the foundation, they developed a working relationship. Macrinus was positioned as an advisor to the emperor, not just a provincial commander. This was elevated status. This meant involvement in imperial decision-making. This meant proximity to power at the highest level. As Rome's military situation became increasingly desperate along the northern frontier, as resources had to be allocated, as strategies had to be formulated, Macrinus would have been part of those conversations. He would have had influence. He would have been shaping how Rome responded to threats. It remains unclear exactly how involved Macrinus was in the Marcomannic Wars themselves, whether he fought directly, whether he commanded forces in the field, whether he remained in administrative positions. The sources don't specify, but it's plausible that given his rising status, given his military experience, given his closeness to the emperor, he was involved in some capacity. He would have been a key figure in managing Rome's military operations on at least one of the frontiers. As the wars dragged on, as the strain on the empire increased, men like Macrinus would have become more valuable. Experienced commanders who understood frontier warfare, who knew how to manage complex military operations, who had the emperor's trust. Such men would have been essential to Rome's ability to maintain its position. By 170 AD, Macrinus had reached one of the highest positions available to a Roman officer who wasn't born a senator. He became Proconsul of Asia. Asia was the richest province in the empire. It encompassed vast territories in the eastern Mediterranean, controlled crucial trade routes, and generated enormous wealth. To be Proconsul of Asia was to be given authority over one of Rome's most valuable possessions. It was recognition of achievement. It was access to wealth on a scale that made his earlier fortunes seem modest. The proconsul governed the province directly, answered only to the emperor, administered justice, oversaw taxation, and controlled military forces. It was one of the most powerful positions an individual could hold in the empire, outside of the imperial household itself. This is where the trail of Macrinus largely goes cold in the historical record. We know he held the position. We know the tenure. We know that he was a man of significant wealth and standing when he finally died. But the specific details of what happened during his time as proconsul, what decisions he made, how he used his authority, these are lost. The sources simply don't preserve that information. What we're left with is a skeleton of a life. A man born in obscurity, who rose through military competence, who positioned himself brilliantly through changing political circumstances, who accumulated power and wealth through decades of service. A man who, unlike Ridley Scott's fictional Maximus, never fell from grace, never lost his family, never had to claw his way back from slavery. The contrast is striking. The cinema wanted tragedy. The cinema wanted a hero brought low, forced to fight for redemption. The actual history delivered something far more mundane, a successful career. a man who understood how to work within systems, how to build relationships, how to recognize opportunity and seize it. Macrinus was never going to be dramatic, never going to be. He was never going to inspire romantic narratives about justice and vengeance. He was a bureaucrat, an administrator, a military professional who served his emperor and accumulated wealth doing so. This is the unglamorous reality of most of human history. Most people who rise don't do so through dramatic acts of heroism. They do so through competence, luck, connections, and the ability to be in the right place when opportunity arrives. The Marcomannic Wars that dominated Marcus Aurelius's reign were brutal, expensive, and ultimately inconclusive. The Germanic tribes kept pressing against Roman borders. The empire kept throwing resources at the problem, year after year of conflict, of soldiers dying, of money being spent, of the empire's resources being stretched thinner. This was the crisis that defined the emperor's reign. This was the crucible that tested Rome's military machine. And somehow, Marcus Aurelius held it together. He prevented the collapse that many feared. He maintained Rome's position. Whether Macrinus played a direct role in these campaigns, or whether he remained more in an advisory capacity, the fact remains that he survived them. He prospered. He advanced. This itself suggests competence. In a time of crisis, in an empire under stress, ambitious officers often fell. They made wrong decisions. They were blamed for failures. They were removed from power or executed. That Macrinus not only survived but advanced during this period suggests that Marcus Aurelius valued him highly. The transition from frontier commander to provincial governor would have felt natural to someone of Macrinus's background. You had learned to manage a region, to command military forces, to extract wealth and resources. You had built networks of alliances. You had proven you could handle the complexities of imperial governance. Posting to Asia would have seemed like the capstone to a successful career. You were no longer in the frontier wars. You were governing one of the richest parts of the empire. You were answerable only to the emperor. You had access to wealth on a scale that most people couldn't even imagine. This was success by the standards of the Roman system. This was what ambition achieved when properly directed and fortunately timed. The question that haunts us is what happened after. What did Macrinus do with the authority granted him in Asia? Did he govern well? Did he exploit the province for personal wealth? Did he maintain the balance between extracting resources for Rome and allowing the province to prosper? Was he fair in his administration of justice? Or did he use judicial authority as a tool for personal gain? These are the questions that would define a proconsul's legacy. These are the questions that contemporaries would have asked. But for history, these answers are simply unavailable. The sources don't tell us. The records don't survive. We have the basic facts of his career, but not the texture of his personality or the quality of his governance. What we do have, preserved by accident and the Tiber River's flooding, is his tomb, a marble mausoleum that speaks to wealth and status, a burial place befitting a man of considerable importance. The inscriptions on that tomb, deciphered by modern archaeologists, became our window into his existence. Without that tomb, Macrinus would be completely unknown. Without those marble walls and Latin inscriptions, he would be one of millions of Roman officials, preserved only in fragmentary references, if at all. But the flood that destroyed much of the mausoleum's structure also preserved it. The mud and water that washed over it sealed it against further decay. The tomb survived, and in surviving, it ensured that Macrinus's name would eventually reach modern ears, would be studied by historians, would inspire questions about the real versus fictional lives of ancient Rome's powerful men. The discovery of that tomb in 2008 was significant because marble structures from the Roman period are often dismantled over centuries. The stone gets repurposed, it gets crushed to make lime, it disappears into the landscape, cannibalized for later construction projects. But Macrinus's tomb, partially buried by the Tiber's ancient flooding, escaped that fate. The archaeological teams that eventually uncovered it found something remarkable, a structure still largely intact, its architectural details still visible, its marble columns still recognizable as the work of skilled craftsmen. The inscriptions were legible. The dates were readable. The dimensions of the structure spoke to the wealth and importance of the man buried beneath. This was no modest grave marker. This was a statement. This was a man saying, even in death, I was someone. I mattered. I accumulated power and wealth. I achieved positions of real authority. Remember me. The very existence of such a tomb tells us something about Macrinus' success. Only wealthy men, or men connected to powerful patrons, could afford such elaborate burial places. The marble alone would have cost a fortune. The skilled craftsmen required to build it would have demanded substantial payment. The location near the Tiber in Rome itself, not in some provincial city, but in the capital, speaks to status. This was a man who could command resources, who had connections in Rome itself, who had the authority to create a lasting monument to himself. The tomb is, in many ways, Macrinus' ultimate achievement in the historical record. Not his military victories, not his provincial appointments, not his wealth, but this marble structure that happened to survive when almost everything else about him disappeared. When archaeologists examined the tomb's inscriptions and compared them to other historical references, they began to reconstruct his career. They found dates that aligned with provincial records. They found ranks and titles that matched other documentation. They found evidence that corroborated the basic facts of his rise through the Roman system. In pieces and fragments, they assembled a skeleton of a life, a man who began in obscurity in a northern Italian city, a man who somehow gained access to the military system, a man who rose through competence and opportunity, a man who, by the end of his life, had achieved one of the highest positions available to someone without being born into the senatorial class. A success story by Roman standards. A life that proved the system worked, at least for those positioned to take advantage of it. And yet, for all that achievement, Macrinus is almost completely forgotten. His tomb survived, but who visits it? Who studies it? Who thinks about Marcus Nonius Macrinus when they consider great figures of Roman history? He is known primarily through the film that fictionalized him, through a character that bears little resemblance to the real man. Ridley Scott's Maximus became famous. The real Macrinus remained obscure. This is the strange irony of history. The dramatic narrative conquers the real one. The story that should have been told gets replaced by the story that audiences prefer. A successful career gets transformed into a tragic fall and redemption arc, because that's what makes compelling cinema. The real Macrinus, competent, ambitious, successful, wealthy, becomes footnote, while the fictional Maximus becomes legend. This tension between history and narrative, between what actually happened and what we want to believe happened, is at the heart of understanding figures like Macrinus. He was not the hero. He did not fight for justice. He did not seek vengeance for a murdered family. He was a bureaucrat who worked within the system and benefited from it. He was a professional soldier who understood how military hierarchies functioned. He was a political operator who positioned himself correctly at crucial moments. He was, in short, ordinary by the standards of successful, ambitious men of his era. And perhaps that's why his story matters precisely because it's so common. Thousands of men, like Macrinus, climbed the ladder of Roman society. Most are completely forgotten. A few are preserved in fragments and ruins. This one happened to leave behind a tomb that survived. The arena existed in Macrinus' time, but not in the way Hollywood imagined it. The blood sports were real, the crowds were genuine, and the death was authentic. But the arena wasn't the primary stage of political power in the 2nd century Rome. That stage existed in the provincial bureaucracies, in the councils of war, in the complex networks of alliances that bound the empire together. Macrinus moved through a world where violence was certainly present, But it was managed violence, controlled violence, the kind that served purposes beyond entertainment. He would have attended games, certainly. Every Roman official attended games. They were part of the civic experience, part of being integrated into the power structure. But he would have attended as an observer, as someone positioned to understand what the games meant politically, rather than as a spectator seeking thrills. The games served multiple functions. They were pressure relief valves for urban populations. They were displays of power by local magistrates seeking to advance politically. They were entertainment, yes, but more importantly, they were theatre, political theatre. When Macrinus commanded troops or governed provinces, he did so with full awareness that the apparatus of public spectacle was always running in the background. Cities had to be kept pacified, crowds had to be distracted, and the games provided the mechanism for both. Consider what Macrinus would have witnessed in the arenas of Rome and the provinces. The scale of violence was real, but it was choreographed. Combats were announced weeks in advance. Advertisements were posted on walls and in forums. The crowd anticipation built gradually. On the day of the games, the crowds arrived early, securing seating according to their social rank. The emperor or his representative would enter to fanfare. The crowd would rise in respect or fear, depending on their relationship to power. And then the spectacle would begin. Macrinus, seated in whatever position his rank allowed, would have understood that this wasn't random violence. This was an expression of imperial power made visible through carefully controlled bloodshed. The fighters who entered the arena had trained for years. They knew the techniques, they understood the risks. Many were professionals who had fought dozens of times. Some were enslaved, yes, but others were free men who had chosen this profession because it offered opportunity for wealth and fame. The outcome was often predetermined, or at least influenced by political considerations. The emperor or local magistrate putting on the games wanted spectacle, wanted the crowd to be satisfied, wanted the message sent by the violence to align with their political interests. A particular factio, N, might be celebrated through the victory of a favored fighter. A particular enemy might be humiliated through the defeat of a fighter associated with them. The games were political communication conducted through the medium of organized violence. The actual combat that took place in arenas was more organized than modern imagination suggests. It wasn't random brutality. There were rules. There were professional fighters who trained for years. There were schools where gladiators learned their craft, developed expertise, accumulated experience. A successful gladiator could become wealthy, famous, celebrated. They were the athletes of their age. The celebrities. Some were enslaved, yes, but many were free men who chose to fight because the pay was good and the rewards could be substantial if they survived long enough to build a reputation. This isn't to minimize the horror of gladiatorial combat, but rather to understand it in its actual complexity. Macrinus, as a military officer, would have understood this system intimately. He would have known that the games served multiple functions. They channeled violence into controlled environments. They identified and rewarded physical excellence. They bound populations to their leaders through spectacle and shared experience. The emperor who provided the best games won the loyalty of the urban masses. This was not cynicism. This was how governance actually worked. But there was another dimension to Roman political life that's often overlooked in discussions of the arena. The actual threat of violent death came not from the gladiatorial games, but from political competition itself. Men jostled for position constantly. Alliances shifted. Favor could transform into disgrace overnight. A military officer who failed in his duties, who crossed the wrong person, who backed the wrong faction during a succession dispute. Such a man could find himself removed from power, stripped of authority, even executed. This was the real danger. This was the arena where Macrinus operated, and apparently he navigated it successfully because he survived and prospered. But there must have been moments of vulnerability, moments where his position was precarious, where enemies were circling, where a miscalculation could have ended everything. The fact that we don't know about these moments doesn't mean they didn't happen. It means the historical record doesn't preserve them. But the very absence of scandal in Macrinus's career, the fact that he advanced rather than fell, suggests either that he was extraordinarily careful or extraordinarily fortunate. Probably both. Marcus Aurelius's reign was marked by constant pressure from enemies. The Marcomannic Wars were draining the empire's resources in a way that created opportunities for dissent. When resources are scarce, when men are dying on distant frontiers, when the costs of military campaigns exceed the benefits, factions emerge. The conservative elements within the Roman elite who opposed further expansion, the ambitious younger officers seeking to position themselves for eventual power, the provincial administrators calculating how to protect their own interests during uncertain times. All of these groups had incentives to resist or conspire. We know that conspiracies happened during Marcus Aurelius's reign. We know that some officers were removed from power. We know that the emperor had to navigate complex factional politics while also managing the military crisis on the frontier. Whether Macrinus was involved in any conspiracies, whether he faced threats to his position, whether he had to maneuver carefully to survive, none of this is documented. But it's plausible. It's the kind of thing that would have happened routinely to ambitious officers operating at his level. The tensions during Marcus Aurelius's reign were real and profound. The emperor was spending enormous sums on military campaigns. The treasury was being depleted. Military families were losing sons on distant frontiers. There was grumbling among certain elements of the aristocracy who questioned whether endless warfare against Germanic tribes was worth the cost. Some argued for negotiation, for paying tribute, for accepting the limits of Roman expansion. Others were more hawkish, wanting to continue aggressive campaigns to secure the empire's borders permanently. Macrinus, as a military man who was close to the emperor, would have been positioned between these factions. He would have had to maintain relationships with both sides while appearing to support the emperor's policies. This kind of balancing act is treacherous. One misstep, one statement overheard and reported out of context, one alliance that appears too close to powerful rivals, and a man can find himself marginalized or worse. The fact that Macrinus navigated these tensions successfully suggests either that he was extraordinarily careful with his words, or that he had enough power that others were careful not to cross him. One of the most interesting aspects of the fragmentary historical record surrounding Macrinus is how little political intrigue is actually documented. Either Macrinus was so politically astute that he avoided creating enemies, or the sources have simply disappeared. In a court rife with competition, serving under two emperors, holding positions of significant power, it's difficult to imagine he had no conflicts. Yet the sources tell us almost nothing about his political relationships, his alliances, his adversaries. This silence might suggest he built relationships carefully and didn't create scandals that historians would record. Or it might simply mean his career didn't generate the documentation that would preserve such details. The position of proconsul in Asia, which Macrinus eventually attained, was prestigious, but potentially dangerous. Asia was wealthy and heavily scrutinized by the empire's central authorities. The governor collected vast sums in taxation, commanded military forces, and administered justice across a large region. These factors meant he could build a fortune and establish himself as a major player, or face accusations of corruption and disloyalty. Macrinus apparently navigated this successfully, understanding the limits of what he could take and how to maintain balance between personal interests and serving the empire. By the time Macrinus reached the position of Proconsul of Asia, he was probably in his mid-50s or early 60s. He had already spent decades accumulating power, wealth, and experience. He had survived multiple transitions of power. He had navigated the complex politics of the frontier wars. He had built relationships with the most powerful men in the empire. If there were conspiracies swirling around him, if there were enemies plotting against him, the sources don't tell us. What we know is that he held power, that he accumulated wealth, that he died in possession of his authority and his fortune. The contrast with the fictional Maximus is absolutely stark. In the film, Maximus's power is stripped from him arbitrarily. He's thrown into slavery. He has to fight his way back through the arena. He achieves redemption through violence and sacrifice. This is the narrative of the falsely accused, of the victim seeking vindication. It's a powerful story, but it bears no resemblance to what we know about the real Macrinus. There's no evidence that he faced the kind of catastrophic fall depicted in the film. There's no evidence that he was stripped of power unjustly. There's no evidence that he spent any time as a slave or that he had to fight in the arena. His life was successful by the standards of Roman officialdom. He rose steadily. He accumulated power and wealth. He held prestigious positions. He died in office or shortly after retirement, with his reputation and his fortune intact. The real story of Marcus Nonius Macrinus is not a story of tragedy and redemption. It's a story of successful navigation of a complex political system. It's a story of a man who understood how power worked and positioned himself to benefit from it. Death came to Macrinus as it comes to all men, but we don't actually know the details. Did he die suddenly? Did he suffer a long illness? Did he pass peacefully in his sleep? Did he die in office as proconsul? Or did he retire and die some years later? The sources don't tell us. What we know is that he died with his position intact, that he was wealthy enough to command a substantial tomb, that his family was important enough that his burial place was marked with inscriptions that survived for nearly 2,000 years. The death itself is unremarkable historically. It's the aftermath that matters for understanding Macrinus's legacy. He died, and the empire continued. His position was passed to someone else. His wealth was distributed according to his will to his heirs. His memory was preserved in stone and inscription. The uncertainty surrounding Macrinus's final years actually tells us something important about how Roman succession worked. There's no evidence of a dramatic deathbed scene. There's no record of final speeches or dying wishes or conflict over the inheritance. This might suggest that his succession was orderly, that whoever came after him faced no significant opposition, that his family accepted the transfer of his wealth and properties without contention. Or it might simply mean that those events, even if they were dramatic, weren't considered significant enough to preserve in historical documentation. Death itself was becoming routine for a man who had lived into his 60s or 70s in an era when such longevity was unusual. He had outlived most of his contemporaries. He had probably outlived many of his rivals. He had watched younger men come up through the ranks and eventually surpass him in authority or power. By the time he died, he was probably a figure from an earlier era, someone respected, but perhaps slightly displaced by the changing dynamics of power. For a few generations, his descendants probably held his memory. They might have felt pride in his accomplishments. They might have seen themselves as heirs to his prestige and position. But gradually, as is the case with most families, the direct line either ended or faded into obscurity. His descendants either died out or merged into the general population of the Roman elite, losing the distinctive connection to Macrinus himself. Without a dramatic story to preserve his memory, without scandals or tragedies to record, without the kind of historical significance that gets mentioned in chronicles and histories, Macrinus became invisible to subsequent generations. His name lived on in documents, in the inscriptions on his tomb, in the occasional reference in administrative records. But the man himself disappeared. The lived reality of Marcus Nonius Macrinus, his personality, his thoughts, his intimate relationships, his ambitions and fears, all of this disappeared with him, leaving behind only the skeleton of his career. The tomb near the Tiber River in Rome testifies to the significance of his position. Only wealthy men could command such structures. Only men with power and influence could ensure that their final resting place would be marked with marble and inscriptions. The very existence of the tomb tells us that Macrinus was successful by Roman standards. He achieved enough to warrant monumentalization. He accumulated enough wealth to pay for it. He had enough social standing that his family could ensure he was properly commemorated. The inscriptions on the tomb would have listed his positions, his achievements, perhaps his accomplishments. They would have served as a resume of his career, a public statement of his importance. In this way, the tomb is his ultimate self-assertion. It's saying to the world, I mattered, I held important positions, I was someone, remember me. The peculiar tragedy of Macrinus is that he succeeded. He accomplished what he set out to accomplish. He rose through the system, accumulated power and wealth, achieved high office, died in possession of his dignity and fortune. By any objective measure, his life was a success. But because his success was not dramatic, because it did not involve a spectacular fall and redemption, because it unfolded through competence and political acumen rather than through heroic struggle, his life has been almost completely forgotten. He is known primarily as the source material for a fictional character who had a completely different life. The real man has been displaced by the fictional one. The boring success of actual history has been replaced by the dramatic tragedy of Hollywood narrative. In Ascent, this is the final irony of Macrinus's life. He succeeded in everything he attempted, but his success was so complete, so integrated into the normal functioning of the empire, that it left almost no trace, no dramatic stories, no scandals to record, no tragedies to commemorate. Just a man who did his job well, accumulated wealth, and died. The archaeological evidence is all that remains of Marcus Nonius Macrinus beyond the film that fictionalized him. When the tomb was discovered in 2008, it represented one of those moments where history suddenly becomes tangible. These were the bones of Macrinus, or at least the chamber where his remains had been placed. These were the stones that had been placed to mark his importance. These were the inscriptions, written by someone who knew him or his family, intended to preserve his name and accomplishments. The archaeological team that examined the tomb would have felt something of the connection between past and present. Here was physical evidence of a man who had lived nearly 2,000 years ago. Here was proof that he had existed, that he had mattered enough to his family to warrant this kind of commemoration. The marble was worn but still recognizable as the work of skilled craftsmen. The columns still stood, still demonstrated the architectural sophistication of Roman tomb construction. The inscriptions were still readable, though they required translation and careful study to fully understand. In that moment of discovery, Macrinus became real in a way he hadn't been for centuries. He wasn't just a name in a text or a source material for a film. He was a person whose family had loved him enough to ensure his commemoration. He was someone whose achievements had been significant enough to merit stone and marble. But the discovery didn't lead to widespread knowledge of Macrinus. It didn't transform him into a famous historical figure. Outside of academic circles and archaeological communities, the discovery of his tomb was barely noted. Even specialists in Roman history might not be aware of it. Macrinus remained obscure. The funding for restoration of the tomb was cut. The site fell into disrepair. The stones that had survived nearly 2,000 years began to deteriorate again under modern neglect. The very irony that Macrinus's life exemplified, success followed by obscurity, was replicated in his tomb. It had been preserved by accident, by the Tiber's flooding. It had survived because it was hidden, buried, removed from the normal processes of destruction and repurposing. And then when it was finally discovered and brought back to public attention, it was allowed to fall into disrepair again because there wasn't funding or interest to properly maintain it. What the tomb reveals about Macrinus is that he was genuinely important in his time. The resources devoted to his commemoration, the quality of the marble, the inscriptions, the architectural sophistication, all of these demonstrate that he held real power and accumulated real wealth. He wasn't a minor provincial official. He was someone significant enough to warrant substantial investment in his memorial. His descendants or patrons believed that his name should be remembered, that future generations should know where he was buried, that his accomplishments should be preserved in stone. For a while they got what they wanted. His tomb survived. His name was preserved. But then history moved on. The centuries passed. The tomb was buried beneath the Tiber's mud. Macrinus became a name without a face, a position without a person, a historical footnote without a clear narrative. The legacy of Marcus Nonius Macrinus is ultimately the legacy of most successful men. He did what he was supposed to do. He did it well. He accumulated the rewards that came with that success. And then he died, and history moved on. His successors inherited his wealth, or built on his connections, or forgot about him entirely. His family either maintained their prominence or faded into obscurity. His name was preserved in marble, but eventually disappeared from memory, except for specialists. The real failure of Macrinus is not that his life was incomplete or tragic. It's that his life was completely normal. It succeeded entirely within the system it operated. It generated no dramatic narratives. It produced no scandals, no tragedies, no redemption arcs. It was simply the life of a successful Roman official. And in being so normal, so unremarkable in its success, it became invisible. What makes the contrast with Ridley Scott's Maximus so stark is that the film understood something crucial about how stories work. Normal success doesn't make compelling narrative. A man who rises through competence and political acumen and dies wealthy and respected. That's not a story audiences want to hear. They want to hear about men who fall catastrophically and rise again through struggle and sacrifice. They want to see the impossible overcome. They want to believe that character and determination matter more than political connections and fortunate timing. The film took the basic facts of Macrinus's position, a powerful general serving a Roman emperor, and transformed them into a narrative that could resonate with modern audiences. In doing so, it made Maximus famous and left Macrinus obscure. This is the final victory of fiction over history. The invented character has become more real, more known, more influential than the actual man. Millions of people have watched Ridley Scott's film and felt moved by Maximus's story. How many have ever heard of Marcus Nonius Macrinus? This is what happens when the real world refuses to conform to narrative demands. History becomes footnote while the fiction becomes legend. The tomb remains by the Tiber, slowly deteriorating, a monument to a man whose greatest achievement was being successful in ways that left no trace worthy of remembrance.